discourse analysis and ego analysis, the age-old debate, Anna Freud or Melanie Klein, Foxy Brown or Lil Kim.
This is freaking you got the commentary by Joe Rogan in the background for this MMA fight.
We're gonna see once and for all who's got the who can lay the smack down.
Exactly. Is there anything you wanted to add before we actually get into the line by line, or
I mean, last week was tricky.
Yeah, Verneinung. And really kind of just letting it sit in. Like, we know that, like, one, like the unconscious knows no time. You know, everything's all in there from the past in the present, and just formulates, and it's affirmative. But what makes it interesting is the fact it's like, well, if repression is being repressed by the defense mechanisms, like, there's this split not only between the ego and the unconscious, but it's like the ego is always pretty much it's negating based off not just that example, like, oh, I had a dream about a woman, but I guarantee you it's not my mother. But it's the fact that, like, there's this negation that is on the level of judgment and perception, but also the closer it gets to breaking away from that, it seems like, with the affirmation aspect of the unconscious, because it knows no time, because it knows no perception or anything, it's just constantly reappearing and affirming. And I think this is something that kind of gets more elaborated on. Renana never gets or like just the function of the unconscious is always being developed by Lacan, and especially in Seminar 11, where he says that he switches it to something being like constantly reappearing. But what is reappearing, or what is repeating in that? And you can see it's like the drive, or like the drive to work through, the drive of repression, of the repressed, that is affirming, while it seems like the ego is constantly in negation.
Right. The ego is constantly in negation.
Yeah. And it's, I mean, I feel like this is like will be answered later on, like not even just like looking at Seminar 11. I just had a perfect example because I was skimming through Seminar 11 and everything started to make more sense going back to it this past weekend.
So he doesn't take up Verneinung again?
I mean, I think Verneinung just overall plays out in the work in example and in practice, where it's like we're kind of like isolating the abstract concept of it, so it seems a little bewildering. But like you see how Alphabon and negation play out through the subject, or just through the ego. I would say like the Verneinung, since it is negation, it's like it's the ego is, it's never whole, or it's never like a positive, it's always a negative, you know. And this is where we see the primary narcissism is furthering its alienation to the secondary narcissism, which that might be going into a little too much because we haven't even introduced the optical schema.
Well, yeah, maybe we can just take a look back on some of the German terms here that we've been using. Yeah, just as a reminder, it's like Verneinung is translated as negation or denegation. And it's a complicated idea because it is related to resistance, as we established, and it's a form of negation which can be productive and which marks the place of the unconscious's emergence in some sense. Not that like it gives you a clear window into what's going on in the inner workings of the unconscious, but it's like the presence of the unconscious is there. And I feel like in a sense, and maybe you can clarify this from a more clinical perspective, but just thinking about this, it seems like when we're dealing with resistances, when we're dealing with transference, all of the examples we've cited up until this point, and I'll remind us that, like, he uses, when he talks about the pathogenic nucleus, he also uses the word story to describe what's going on with this kind of, mass of signifiers that is the ego. And I think it's like, when it comes to, let's say, the transference, we have a past experience maybe being played out in the present.
Yeah.
And it's like what we're harking back to, it's like I feel like we're almost witnessing the formation of the ego all over again.
Yeah.
Almost like sped up in a sense. And that's what Verneinung sort of gives us a glimpse of. It's like, here is the point where the ego is formed,
Yeah. And so you said, like, let's maybe we could use an example of the clinical sense. Let's think about it in a philosophical sense, in the format that this is like the Hegel's logic. And I think this is also probably important, like why he wants Hippolyte to give this commentary, because he's the Hegelian. But looking at the response to the commentary on Hippolyte's commentary on Verneinung, how, like, Lacan was saying how, like, because of this investigation in Verneinung and looking at it from a philosophical lens through the dialectic, it seems like Freud, for his time, presupposed a subject not based upon some type of substance or positive notion, like in a scientific sense, but he was aiming at something, like he said, like lest we say of a philosophical subject of negativity, of a nothingness, rather than a substance or a positive being. And like, also, it kind of makes more sense now that, I mean, he says being in nothingness because he references Sartre, and I'm going through Sartre's work right now, and he's going over being in nothingness. Obviously, that's the name of the text, but like the dialectic of the nothingness. But it seems like for Verneinung, as it pertains to the ego is always trying to determine itself, but it can't determine itself from within, because it has no choice but to project outwards. And the alienation from the master signifier, or from the S1, is the admission into the symbolic, into the Oedipal complex, into the Oedipus logic, which further determines it, but it's still split, and it has no choice but to also go back within. But within is also the unconscious, but the resistance keeps that unconscious. So it's like this repulsion. So you have not just like the ego and the unconscious, or something that are like on two sides of the same coin. Rather, it's its contradiction. It is its negation. And to bring it back to the clinical aspect, when we look at full speech and empty speech, the empty speech is going to be the idle chatter of the ego, and the ego's determination of itself through its fantasies, through its use of words that make it concrete and coherent. But as it continues to try to associate or to maybe provoke the analyst is already waiting for these resistances, and further that until the ego's determination leads to negation.
Wait, so
into the full speech, which is where we get the affirmation of the unconscious.
when you said that they're not two sides of the same coin, consciousness and the unconscious, but rather, would you say the conscious ego is the negation of the unconscious?
Yeah, they're contradictions. There's a split. Rather than seeing like on a polarity, or like two sides of the same coin, or like complementary, they're literally like the contradiction.
And the negation of that which knows no negation, which does know a no, which is only.
And to tie in like one more thing to Aufhebung, right? The suspension, the overpassing, the sublation. Because you mentioned the transference. It's like in the transference, because it involves an intersubjective relationship, this is like, in a sense, where master-slave dialectic comes in, the lord and bondsman, this interrelation of recognition. You could see Aufhebung as the transference of the contradiction of the unconscious, either reducing to a certain element or pretty much surpassing the first contradiction of, if we use the Oedipal complex of the patient and his relationship to the father function in the phallus. Now, that contradiction and that struggle gets, surpassed, but then it gets projected into a new dialectical mastery onto the analyst. And that's where the analyst wants to be like, okay, now I see where the symbolic logic of the phallus or the repression, whatever you want to use.
A lot to unpack there, but is this why Kant keeps bringing this back to the genital plane?
Yeah, I think so as well, because you see like where you're trying to get to the core of the unconscious in any way where there is repression, there is some type of, I guess, deformation or whatever language would be used. And I don't know how much further like Lacan would use. I think Lacan would later disregard those terms like most Freudians would, like, unless they're like dogmatic Freudians that like to use the development of libido in terms of oral, anal, genital, latent, phallic. Because I think Lacan disregards those later on in his like Seminar 11 to his later works, and moves to his own thing.
So to bring it back to Aufhebung, like now we're talking about the dialectic here. You can read that as the dialectic. Sublation is another translation for that. But what's interesting to me is that I never really thought about the ego as itself a dialectic.
Yeah,
that is
subjectivity
purely negative. And would you agree with the idea that what he's criticizing by citing most of these other analysts and what he interprets as their misdeeds is the fact that they, well, in this case, Anna Freud maybe tends to interpret the ego as something positive or with positive contents or with a positive sort of trajectory to it.
Yeah, to the most part, yeah. And this could lead us into starting to get more into the difference between Anna Freud and Melanie Klein. But like, I'll lead on that last note. Like, not only Anna Freud, but just ego psychologists in general find that there is a synthesis of the ego, where it's like these resistances to strengthen and make the ego healthy act as like a synthetical way of making it unified. Like these resistances prior, which lead to like some sort of illness and neuroses, melancholia, etc., are these dialectical struggles and oppositions within the person. And then it's like what's being affected is the ego. But if we create like these healthy manners of free associating, at least in psychoanalysis, free associating or whatever, or like if you look at it in like American ego psychology, DBT, CBT, using these techniques of deep breathing, of Socratic questioning, of finding an automatic thought, and cognitive ways to help create a synthetical, whole, coherent self.
Right.
Somewhat to be like healthy and productive in society. Yeah.
Something that is integrated.
Yeah, integration and synthesis.
And integrated along the lines of a modeled ego. And what this seems to me to imply is almost a complete bastardization of the dialectic in the Hegelian sense, or in this case, the Kojèvian sense, because what we have is, and this is how when you learn your Hegel 101, the really like cartoonish notion of the dialectic that you're exposed to is that you have thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and synthesis is the best of both worlds, and that's what we're dealing with. And isn't that great? And of course, everyone's going to, and people dismiss Hegel on that basis because it's like they don't understand what they're talking about to begin with. That's not what the dialectic is. But here we have, not to say Anna Freud was influenced by Hegel, but here we have something like like a caricature of the dialectic, and it's something that he uses the word median later. It's something which is predicated on the realization of a median between, I guess, the weak ego of the analysand and the strong ego of the analyst, and of course is also predicated on this notion of the little, I like this, the little man within the man, who's just, and this persists to this day. I mean, it's never been this real like butchering of an idea has never had more prominence than, I would say, today, of the little man within the man, self-realization, actualization, and bringing that out. And that's the purpose of all talk therapy.
The mindfulness coach app, and just like, telling you how to deep breathe and be mindful, like body scanning, and then it's like visualize that you're on a beach, seeing your true self, how you really feel, and embody it, be bold, embrace it, like all these terms, just to kind of create that agalma, that fantasy of that objet petit a, that this is what you're supposed to be.
And I just want to add two more things that I find interesting. One is that we have to remember that the dialectic we're actually dealing with when we talk about Lacan's notion of Verneinung and Aufhebung and all of this is one between inside and outside. And one of the things he's going to say is that we don't have this clear distinction between subjective and objective that we think we do. And two, which I think is interesting, because he makes some allusions also to the like mechanical processes, and very simple, not simple at all, but like what might seem like a not so philosophical notion of just gaining control of your body and these motor functions. And somehow it's like, it's an interesting two things to tie together. It's like, how is your own self-image in some way tied up with your motor functions and your sense of self-mastery? And that's what he wants to depict here by contrasting Anna Freud with Melanie Klein, two schools of thought on the same matter of object relations.
Yeah, so that's a good point. Yeah, that is a great detail to analyze the whole thing of bodily function and just mastery, which is like pretty much we get that in the next chapter, at least his way of depicting one's position in the three registers, the symbolic, real, and imaginary.
Right, and that's the other thing, is that he's also really striving to distinguish the three registers, show how they're interconnected, but at this point he wants to define them as they don't exist autonomously, but he's really striving to give his auditors a strong impression of what each of these three registers are, only to, we're talking about entire career-wide ambition to tie them all together, and eventually object A is going to pop out of that. But right now it seems like he's introducing, because like we said, there's this age-old rivalry between like who got it right. Was it Anna Freud? Was it Melanie Klein? And he quotes this long passage, which it's not all that interesting. It's just about, she has this analysand who is very defensive and is, as she interprets it, uncomfortable with her own affects, and the more effective she becomes, the more she mocks herself, and she feels that the defenses need to be analyzed here, and that she is able to get past her defenses and analyze, like, I guess, what's behind it. But I think Lacan feels like she's missing something, because we're at the level of kind of two-body.
Yeah, and she definitely conducts a countertransference where she's like, oh, she's acting aggressive towards me, so I have to act in such a way where I could calm her down. Thus, the countertransference feeds into the analyzand, and in this, it interrupts the process of guiding the treatment, and she guides the patient instead.
Right. And of course, Lacan feels like that's the wrong approach.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, like, with the whole distinction of at least Klein versus Freud, Anna Freud was like, they both, and I mentioned this to you like on private, like apparently Anna Freud was working through a lot of the earlier works of her father, whereas Klein was more associated with the later works of Freud, and which you get like a sort of what Lacan would call the decentering of the subject, the ego, because of beyond the pleasure principle. And there's some framework of even object relations within Freud, as far as the finding of the lost object in the 3 essays of sexuality, which I don't know whether you would structure that as late Freud or if that's like a middle. I don't think that those 3 essays are early Freud. I think those are like more middle to late.
Right. We talked about this a little bit last week,
Mhm.
the refinding of an object. So I find this difficult to like disentangle all of the implications of this, but we talked about introjection and projection, and how is it that we're able to form reliable representations of a perception, to line those up. And Freud's major contention, which Hippolyte points out has enormous philosophical implications, is that essentially we're always refinding objects.
Yeah.
In reality, it's not an endless novelty of experience that needs to be in some sense interpreted or synthesized, but rather we're constantly refinding objects throughout our lived experience. But the issue is that with psychotic episodes, with hallucination, or even with the things that trouble just quote unquote regular neurotic subjects, it's the barrier between inside and outside is not always clear.
Yeah, the difference between the in-welt versus the umwelt.
In-welt, umwelt.
Yeah, the inner world and the outer world, the being in the world, which I think at one point he in the entire seminar he compares the umwelt to like the Heidegger's being in the world type thing. Because again, this is like we're still dealing with early Lacan, so he's in his phenomenology phase, but he's breaking out of it because he's introducing something that is radical, the symbolic order, and it's pretty much its interjection, or just the way it intervenes and interpolates us. To use the word interpolation.
That's a great way to describe it. Yeah. And that, I guess that's what's missing from a lot of phenomenology, is that that interpolation. And I guess I don't know that much Heidegger, but it feels like with Dasein, the problem is it's like correct me if I'm wrong, because you know a lot more Heidegger than I do, but it seems like there aren't guardrails, so to speak, when it comes to being in the world. That there's no structure, or I mean, that's what the supplement that Lacan is introducing is structural linguistics.
I think there is like a kind of like an embryo of that with his hermeneutics, because he always talks about like in the world of projects, the equipment that Dasein is engaged with are always referential, like signs. So I think you see kind of like this embryonic theory of structural linguistics and signifiers and the signified in there, but just not in a linguistic way, but just like how we're always in reference, where there's always something contextual in Daseins projects. Like the hammer is not just a thing, it's not just a being in essence, rather it's always, you know, it's referential. It has significance to us, but it's also referential to building a house, or like nailing a nail onto a board to build, like, you know, like a table or something like that. You know, that's where the reference is. It's never like outside of itself, for lack of a better term. So in a sense, I think there is that like embryonic structure, I'm going to say, of a structural linguistics theory. I don't know if Ferdinand de Saussure was inspired by Heidegger or not, but I kind of get that intuition that he was kind of onto some type of like structuralism in his hermeneutics, at least.
And what do you think of, one more time, Bea Hung, because I feel like this is sort of flown under the radar because the focus is on Verneinung, but
Yeah.
in a
Well,
sense,
Hung is that affirmation aspect.
right, it's the affirmation, and it's tied up with the symbolic, right?
Hung is tied up with I wouldn't say off the top of my head, or like from what I'm familiar with, Hung being tied with the symbolic. I was under the impression that Hung was tied in with the unconscious, and maybe the affirmation of the signifier. So maybe if the unconscious and the nucleus of repression can at least be signified through the symbolic, but it is affirming the unconscious, but it comes to light in the symbolic because it's not tied into this imaginary relationship.
Well, the reason I say it seems like a channel to this symbol, or channel's probably not the right word, but
no, yeah, I think that would be right.
Yeah, in the sense that it's like what we're dealing with here, ice cream. Yeah, what we're dealing with here is when we talk about introjection and projection, something I hadn't realized, but projection is always imaginary and introjection is always symbolic.
Yes.
So before we're talking about this process of creating the ego through this layering that occurs when there's this alteration of the expulsion and taking in, right? There's the taking in is always, in essence, symbolic.
Yeah.
And then when we project outwards, in a bit, we'll talk about the optical schema, it's always imaginary.
Mm-hmm.
And then way later on, we'll bring the symbolic back into the story with the ego ideal, but we're not there yet.
I think overall, like psychoanalysis would, so far as like, I don't want to Lacanianize all psychoanalysis, but like if we have to relate it to any of these three registers, I would say that projection definitely has to deal with some type of an image throughout all psychoanalysis, including Carl Jung, you know, with even transference allows for the process of projection to occur. And there are always images of the ego or of the unconscious, you know, in the form of complexes or archetypes. But in a sense, projection is always something of the imaginary. But
well, that's interesting because he says here that Jung is the one who coined complex, basically.
Yes, yeah.
Context.
Yeah, they're definitely, Jungians are very keen of complexes, whereas like Freudians are drives. But it's like, I feel like there's a triangle with drives, affects, complexes. I feel like the complex needs the drive to continue to repeat itself. And I don't think that the Jungians really take that into play, the drives, because I think they confuse it with sexual instincts or things like that. They're on the lines of instincts and thinking of it as pure biology. But I think, and it's crazy because Jung was around for a very long time. I'm surprised he never came in encounter with, or any of the Zurich school came in encounter with Lacan, like, or like any of his works. They were like secluded. They're in their own little world.
Hermetic order, so to speak.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's not too much more to this chapter. You know, he's talking about the Oedipal structure. They're just so many moving parts here between like the genital plane, the Oedipal structure, the symbolic, and then trying to basically create a productive contrast between Anna Freud and Melanie Klein.
I think the main thing to get from this chapter, insofar as we talk about not Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, are these different things from the not only the ego, that its resistances are not something that need to be taken, where the analyst needs to engage in a countertransference to like, mediate the situation, but rather the fact it's like, again, something that we've talked about in like the beginning, it's that the failure of two-body psychologies, they don't count for the third, and that's language and speech. It's like she's really thinks she's resisting Anna Freud, or Anna Freud really thinks that this patient is resisting her, but no, it's the literally fighting of her unconscious, the affirmation of something that comes up symbolically. So it's not like Biahong in itself is symbolic, like the unconscious is affirming itself, but as it affirms itself, it structures itself in a way that it could be symbolized, because it does structure like a language.
Right.
And yeah, that's one thing that.
No, that's really interesting.
Yeah, doesn't.
I don't think we're here yet, but I highly recommend, and I'm sure you've listened to it, Derek Hook's lecture on function and field.
Yeah, I listened to it all. It's really good. He's really good at breaking things down simply. I think he's a really good scholar.
Yeah, I think he's one of the best to like not oversimplify it, but find the very engaging ways of illustrating certain ideas, and also explaining deep ambiguities that are what turn most people off to Lacan.
Yeah.
His explanation of the symbolic order, which I'm sure we're going to get to later, but something that always eluded me is that it's like it's really hard to wean yourself off of this notion that the symbolic order, like you can identify the symbolic order with the big other to a degree, and then the unconscious, and like come to a fairly workable understanding of how all of those three are like interconnected. But what's hard is to try to wean yourself off of the notion that we're dealing with contents here.
Yeah,
we're not dealing with signifieds, we're dealing with signifiers.
Yes,
signifiers are essentially absences.
Yes, that's a good thing to say. They're just signifiers, but they have no attachment to anything signified. And it's never just this binary relationship like the Saussurian thing. It's a chain and network of references, because ultimately the master signifier is the emptiest, and it has no reference but its own referential ability, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, that's a really great point, something that I forgot to even mention, like when we mentioned function and field in the past. But I think that's what's great about Derek Hook, because he's just really engaged with all of Lacan's work. Also, he's just got like this really great accent and character that helps him. Like, he's just really good, like at just like
animated.
Yeah, very animated person. He's really funny too. But
maybe one day we'll talk to him on here.
Yeah. What I also think is interesting too is that later on, and I think maybe this is where he's coming to terms with the real, but later on you will see that the unconscious, so far as it's always a repetition of something and a temporal like coming and going, it has its situatedness in the real, that it has gaps. There is a gap within the unconscious and the ego, or the consciousness, and this allows for the real to seep in, because like a fissure. But what is the real is just coherency, this raw reality, this traumatic experiences, and the trauma of the real itself just seeps in through, but it has no way to filter through but to the unconscious. So the unconscious is always bringing in the real, and it situates itself in the real, it seems like. But it only comes up in certain doses, like you only get filtrations of it.
And hence the memory being experienced with the help of empty spaces. Whenever we're talking about emptiness, nothingness, or these sort of like, let's say just, empty margins between contents. And this is why, just to take it back to signifier and signified, it's like what we think of as like the beauty and brilliance, and the word Lacan uses later is like the luxuriance of reality, is always on the side of the imaginary. Everything that we celebrate and love supposedly about being alive is often on the side of the imaginary, in the sense that it's the imaginary that gives all of our experience its coloration, image. We have to think about imaginary also as image and imagery, and it's like that is always on the side of the signified, whereas where the treasury of signifiers is not this platonic heaven of ideas, right? Where it's like, well, there's the perfect chair is over here, and this, not that I don't think Plato even intended to say that, another bastardization, but like what you learn in philosophy 101 about the perfect chair, the perfect table, that's not what the treasury of signifiers is. It's more mathematical. Say what you will about Lacan and his ability to employ mathematical ideas, but it's a combinatory, however you say it.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves here, because
We're always gonna get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, it's really it's hard to not like.
I think organization is objet petit a. I think like pure perfect, organized content is, that thing in itself.
Right, exactly. And with this, it's all the way that he articulates his ideas should encourage us to take the same sinuous paths, because it's the only way I feel like it really can be done. And then any reduction of it to something, well, what's he trying to say here, isn't going to quite cut it, But we're dealing, this anticipates so much here.
Yes, this is the best part, though. The Kleinstein.
He's setting it up here.
Yeah.
He's setting the scene. We have little Dick. We have just a treasure trove of Freudian
metaphors,
and that you couldn't make this stuff up, but he's the train.
Yeah, literally just
his mother.
Shots fired on this poor little kid. Melanie Klein says, "You want to fuck your mother."
For the record, that's not what it says exactly in the essay, but you might as well say that. I think he's like misrepresenting her. He's like, "Damn, did you just say it?" So he's setting up the next chapter here, and he repeats this a few times that little Dick is too close to reality. He's living in this undifferentiated realm, sphere, pure experience, das Sehen, almost, you could sort of say, just like a pure undifferentiated.
Yeah, you can't differentiate reality. Yeah. And it's just raw experience. He's literally connected to, he's got an intimate relationship with the real.
Right, and he relates it to anxiety here, which seemingly comes out of nowhere. Do you think you've seen how anxiety fits in?
I would say because anxiety is an overall nothingness and emptiness, like not like an anxiety attack, although maybe one could apply that, but anxiety is always something that is more real than anything. It's the only emotion that doesn't lie. And I think with anxiety overall in psychoanalysis, the way it's dealing with is like this overall angst of reality, that the what you feel, the fantasy that you have about it, this image, persona of yourself slip away, and something true reveals itself that's overbearing. And I know, at least like he would say, that the fetish object or the fantasy hides the fact that behind the curtain, there's really an emptiness, a void, which is that anxiety waiting to reveal itself. I can paraphrase that a bunch, but he says that more in the object relation essay on which is seminar 4. We get more into detail of Kleinianism, Winnicottianism, and all that stuff. But anxiety, we should think of as this like more existential Kierkegaardian type thing. We literally lose control or the power of reality just overbears you, because it is more truer than the fantasy that you had of it.
So what's interesting here is he says that little Dick is living in a world that is so barely symbolized that he's not able to form the sort of identifications that we discussed earlier in the earlier cases, which constitute a neurotic subject who is able, I think by these, when he says these comings and goings, again, we're talking about the sort of introjection projection thing that is required to form
or Verwerfung, refusal, rejection too.
Right, he has none of these strategies at his disposal. Essentially, he is neck to neck, eye to eye with the boy.
And to keep it in the objects relation realm, I don't think he really has a differentiation between good object, bad object, good mommy, bad mommy type thing, which is the point of object relations, is that like when the ego formation develops, it starts to see this in this formation of the ego, this primitive ego, or we could use the term primary narcissism. It's more of a Freudian, Lacanian thing, but like the ability to feel the pleasure or the displeasure in certain objects and judge it by that.
So he's totally paralyzed by anxiety rather than using it productively.
Yeah, in a sense, like with the, I think with the formation again, like I don't think Melanie Klein really has even though there's like symbolization, it's not really symbolic like in the register of Lacan. But it's like there is some type of formation of that kind of ruminates within her theory without realizing it. And that's why I think he believes that she was more closer to the Freudian experience, in the sense that Lacan is trying to get to compared to Anna Freud.
And then, so what's fascinating here is he has some sense of vocables, which I think means any kind of rudiment of a word that you can manipulate in some sense, but he hasn't given a Beahung, he hasn't given an affirmation to them. He hasn't assumed them as his own. So that's really fascinating to me. Again, something hasn't been taken in, right? It hasn't been introjected symbolically.
There's no admission into the symbolic.
There's no admission into the symbolic, which is what affirmation affords the subject, in a sense. Now, this is very enigmatic. I have no idea why this like excessive empathy is somehow one of the consequences of his state. Is that because there's this sort of like constant well, I guess if it's just purely imaginary,
I would say due to because there's like he hasn't differentiated himself. I think he's like still like in this weird limbo purgatory of like still being like one with his mother, like symbiotic, like the symbiotic feeling, like the immediate gratification with that, but at the same time he hasn't had that differentiation. or what we could call even the mirror stage, where it's like, yeah, now he's got the primary narcissism, the formation of the ego, in a sense where it's like, now I have a sense of good object, bad object between me or mommy, me. It's just pure, I'm like, not like the I hyphen mommy, but like the I is immersed by mommy, the function that gratifies the needs. And that's where the whole point in that the commentary that you sent me on, or you sent me about, like, of the actual, or not the commentary, it was the PDF file of the actual case study by Melanie Klein. This whole thing of sadism is the fact that insofar as the mother is the one that feeds the child with the breast object, there is a sadism in which there's too much pleasure where there's no sense of stop, and it could consume mother at whole. It doesn't get the sense of like, oh, I'm done, I'm satisfied. If you just keep going and devouring that which gives.
That's fascinating. So yeah, so what would set a limit on that?
It would be the response of the mother saying like, ow, that hurts, or giving us some type of reaction. That's part of the ego formation in object theory, object relation theory, is that then there's the formation of good object, bad object, that which makes mommy happy and that which hurts mother. And then the admission into, we could call it the symbolic, but like the Oedipus complex is where then now you're in the caught of desire and other objects, not mommy, but you want mommy back, but you want the object that satisfies mommy that you don't have, but it seems like the father has. The phallus. Yep.
Right. So he's at the level of being the imaginary phallus.
He doesn't even know what he is yet. He's still caught in this. That's what I say. Like, let's call it a limbo. Like, because it seems like at some points, especially like he would run into the closet and say mommy, right? So it seems like at some point he's kind of wary of certain things which trigger like, oh, bad object, but he's always identifying with mommy rather than himself. And then he's like, oh, this makes mommy mad, or this makes mommy sad or happy, like, or pleased. It's more of like he's still stuck in the womb.
But
that's why there's also no affects as well. There's no drives. There's no affects with drives. It's just, that's why he's saying there's undifferentiation. But there's something weird because he's still, like Lacan says, he's not an idiot or anything like that. He has some sort of vocals.
He has the barest framework with which to orient himself in something like a reality, but he can't assume himself as an object almost, which is necessary.
And I do keep that in mind when I tell you, like, when Leon Brenner mentions this in the Machine to Current Conscious podcast, it's because this kid was actually on the autistic spectrum, which does make sense now. But insofar as we're describing these things, we see how he has relations to objects, how he has relations to the analyst and mom. It's like this undifferentiatedness, no affects, no responses, no libido drives, in the sense where, at least if ego were developed, then you would have like maybe a neurotic or whatever. And keep it in mind, D and G are like, when we're born, we're all schizophrenic, we're all psychotics, because we have just raw experiences. We're so connected to the real that way. It's only then when we're immersed in symbolic that we become neuroticized. Not pure neurotic subjects, but just neuroticized.
Yeah, I think in the introduction to the ticklish subject, Zizek explores that, and he also claims, probably from a very different perspective, but that, like psychosis, in a sense, or schizophrenia, is something that needs to be overcome by virtue of the Oedipus complex, like through that, like a sort of refinement process, but that in a sense, it's like, and he relates it to the Hegelian sort of like kind of realm of the undifferentiated. I forget exactly what he calls it, but this, it's almost, you have to accept a certain degree of self-deception to be a self
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's definitely like there is this deception via the mirror stage, because you're deceived by the seduction of your own image. You're not even deceived, you're lured in, you're seduced. The scene, the primal scene that sets the seduction.
Right. And then I guess for little Dick, it's like the absence of affects. Affects are performances too. When you say it's like they are messages for the other to a certain degree. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like they're meant to be interpreted in a sense. Like,
Yeah, affects are pretty much just overall responses that have some type of network of signification to it. And there would be drives that presuppose it, depending on what framework, the Freudian framework. It's like drives and then affects. I think it's like for the Jungians, complex affects. But it seems like for like somebody like Otto Kernberg, it's like affects are what are first, and then drives come later. But keep it now, like, affects are sometimes performative and stuff. They have some type of libidinal charge to them, or some emotions to them.
do you know who he's talking about here with Galinier?
I do not. I think this is somebody who does come up in, not in the next one, but like somebody who speaks in the Wolf one. I think he is a speaker. Could be wrong.
So what's interesting is that he's going to use the case of little Dick as a means to explain the imaginary. So we're in the second part of the seminar now. Finally, the topic of the imaginary.
Yeah.
Scroll back up. This is when it really gets interesting. And a lot of this we've already talked about. We've already established that, he doesn't have this distinction between the real imaginary and symbolic. At the very end of the last chapter we looked at, Lacan talks about destructionism, which is something that Hippolyte mentions a little bit. And I guess that's connected with Melanie Klein's notion of sadism.
Yes.
As being kind of central to ego formation. In some sense, I guess that has to do with what you were talking about before with the devouring and the
and it's located, we call in this weird deadlock between the imaginary and the real. There's not like a register of the imaginary par excellence to where there's an ego, because I think in that sense, if there was something wrong in there, it would be a sadomasochism, where not only do they devour, but they also want to feel devoured themselves.
But in this case, sadism is considered by Melanie Klein at least constitutive, and right, like it helps along development.
For the most part, yes, because she thinks that what happens from this libido, at least if she does use libido, I think she does, that in the relationship between the baby and its libido development and the mother feeding, like I said, like let's use a simple example, like the baby's teething too hard, and the reaction is like, ow, that hurts mommy, like not because she's yelling at the kid, but she's like, the mother's intimate with the child. And so, say as she's breastfeeding, she just says that nonchalantly and just talking to the baby, or just like, that hurts mommy. The baby can't understand, the baby doesn't talk, but it's like this constant thing. Then, it starts to fire, it starts to click. Then you have the bad object, good object,
Great.
when not to devour, when to eat. And it's like this conditioning of of libido drives and helping the formation of ego.
Having projected his sadism, he sees it coming back from
Yeah,
these objects, is able to distinguish between bad and good objects on that basis. So he recommends studying geology here as a place to, no pun intended, mine for
yeah,
metaphors. He briefly draws attention to, I didn't realize Traum de Tung is dream work.
yeah. Dream work, the interpretation of dreams, and I think like you could see that as like the geology, because it's like the way the earth not only is in motion, but it's like there's also layers, there's a core to it. So it's like the unconscious, like insofar that there's different memories, have like a core to these memories.
Right, so he turns to this
Yeah,
scheme here only briefly, I guess, to just set the scene for his own optical turn here, which he feels that optics might be more, have more potential when it comes to illustrating certain psychoanalytic concepts.
yeah. Rather than the iceberg or layer theory, which I don't even think that like Freud ever came up with the iceberg. I think the iceberg is just something that we took as something to describe the unconscious id and or like the super ego, ego type thing.
Was it Jung? Seems like something he might do.
No, I don't think it was Jung.
All right, we'll blame Anna Freud then.
I just blame American professors.
Blame Jordan Peterson. Too easy. All right, only one Jordan Peterson reference per episode. I don't know. I don't really understand why he quotes this at length here.
But like, I think it's interesting how he switches from the geology to the optics, because he wants to say that like the optics is like a weird science that doesn't get credited enough, because like where like other scientists will reduce things down to like something that isn't really functional but abstract in theory, like the in biology the cell is one cell, but a cell is never just a cell. It has no choice but to you put it back into play, or like the atom, subatomic particle in physics, a molecule in chemistry. Whereas it seems like with optics, even the image is always at play. Even the image still, has an observer that's observing it. And even in this diagram, I can't help but like this optical schema sounds like to me like almost like a weird quirky version of like the double slit experiment, just with more nuances to it. But I think like what's interesting is he's trying to get at least in the way I'm interpreting it, is like the image is never really reductive, but it's always like a scene. It's always like setting. It's always more than what it really is.
Right. That's what he says at some point here, that it's not reductive like other sciences, but optics is based on an explanation of the production.
Yeah,
It's
kind of dialectical too.
Explain like the production of something which we rely on in more ways than one. And I think what's fascinating is that even with the signifier, I think it's Saussure who describes the signifier as an audio image.
Yeah.
So the signifier itself can be outlined in similar terms, I think.
Most definitely.
Yeah, this is what he
I never
says.
thought of it like that, but yeah, it actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because like the optical schema should also apply to someone who's blind.
Yeah.
They
it's
have
not, he's like, he's saying it's a physical eye, but at the same time, like I'm sure like a blind person could still have fantasy, could still situate themselves, could still have an intuition of who they are. They may not, who knows if they have image thinking, but at least there's some type of verbal thinking.
Right. There's a field
Mhm.
that they're working with
Yeah.
with
I
it with
mean,
certain coordinates, you
yeah.
know.
Look at like the blind kung fu master, 100 Eyes, you know, he's got to be working with some type of image feel to be able to
Yeah.
do arts.
Talk about someone with a strong ego ideal.
Yeah.
So yeah, the strange science sets itself to produce that peculiar images in contrast to other sciences which import into nature, cutting up a dissection and anatomy. That's really fascinating to me. And he says, you know, he doesn't want to make you believe that the moon is made of green cheese. Noted. He could convince me of anything at this point, but so yeah, this is just a sort of, you know, excursus on the nature of images, and I would say he's going to introduce something that isn't controversial because it's contested so much, but controversial more so because of just the manifold interpretations of the optical schema. And I just think like how poorly it's usually explained. It's
Yeah.
there's certain central elements that are often neglected if you really want to get the full picture of the optical schema, and that the PDF you shared with me before was probably the best explanation I've encountered, because there's always something missing in the, you know, they always miss where the plane mirror is and the concave. And I feel like Lacan does the worst job of explaining it, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, he's terrible at explaining his own thing.
Like the just the vocabulary he uses to explain it. Like he doesn't even call it mirror. He calls the mirror like a cauldron. And like,
Yeah, it's so weird. I'm just
oh,
like, such a weird verbiage.
this is a famous example that is mentioned in I know in a few of Zizek's books.
Mhm.
When you see a rainbow, you're seeing something completely subjective.
Yes.
But how does a camera capture it then if it's not just something I imagine?
Yeah,
It's
it's not something
imaginary,
you're hallucinating.
but it's not purely a product of my imagination in the sense that it exists solely for me. Other people can see it. So again, we're coming back to this idea of like we don't have a clear distinction between the subjective and the objective, and we're talking about the place of the subject and the eye that we're about to see in the optical schema exists within a cone whose coordinates are mathematical.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to always like gird your loins when he mentions mathematics at any point, because this is one of the, whenever anyone who's, you know, well, even people who are very familiar with Lacan, they have strong criticisms of like what he does with mathematics, but it does play an important role.
Yeah, you could say that it
Fraud.
definitely has its purpose.
If only metaphorically. I don't know
Yeah.
how great a mathematician he was. Probably
a very terrible one.
Probably very terrible. If his math themes are to be believed, then it's like, all right, he probably doesn't quite know what he's doing.
It's a form of algebra, but just definitely not like something you would learn in algebra 1 or 2.
It's cool, man. Like
Yeah.
You got to give him that. Whatever you think of his charts and graphs and diagrams, they're badass.
They're pretty nifty.
I think they're pretty cool.
Yeah.
And well, that's a whole nother subject, but you know, there's that guy who was on the Machine Unconscious Happy Hour podcast who wrote a book, Lacan the Charlatan, and
yeah, that's a good podcast.
Yeah, and he's like talking about how, well, it's like kind of undermining a certain form of discourse and doing that, you know, and that's stylistic choice that sort of illustrates this entire project.
Yeah.
But
as a thinker, like for not being like a philosophical intellectual, for being like a psychiatrist to somebody who, you know, wanted to return to the works of Freud, practiced psychoanalysis, but also was like, deep into the cut with the heavy intellectuals of his day. I'd say he was pretty nifty in being able to do shit like this and appeal to the audience who were some heavy hitters in the field, French academia, and then to attract a wide audience.
Yeah, because I think to a certain degree, everyone had these like little flourishes in their theory,
Yes.
and like you wanted to flaunt your erudition and your make references and just like you wanted to dazzle. I mean, that was like necessary. And then I think what he's doing a lot of the time is he wants to top everybody with his
Yeah.
showmanship. Like,
It's like, I'm about to hit you with some new shit.
it's like look at Ghostface. Like, he's one of the greatest rappers ever, but like also like he had like the biggest chains ever. He had the fucking eagle on his forearm. Like no one did that. Like a iced out eagle. Like kind of that. Does that mean he's just a showman? Like no, he's very talented too. That's what he's doing here in a sense.
Exactly.
So this is the optical schema. This is he's going to employ this to try to explain in the context of Little Dick, I guess, why he doesn't really have an ego in the classical sense.
Yeah.
I wasn't able to form an ego. And here we go.
Yeah.
Here it is. Now, it bears mentioning that this is just part of the larger schema that's going to develop.
He's only giving us one thing.
You said also in seminar 11 he uses.
Yeah, he uses it again, but like I like to the detail, like how nuanced it is. Like I can't really say it off the top of my head, because it's dealing with I think that the gaze, his whole issue of the gaze of objet petit a. But
we don't have to get into all that.
In here, it's more along the lines of the development of, because here's the main thing. One thing we should keep in mind: this is like his way of stylizing his essay on the mirror stage and the eye function, or the function of the eye. He wants to see it. I think what makes this one distinctly different, or like this specific lecture using the inverted bouquet, is that it introduces the symbolic realm into the phenomenon of the mirror phase. And how you were talking about mathematics plays a thing to it. Well, it's like mathematics is a form of language. It's a measurement, it's a situatedness. It's a measurement that allows us to situate us in the world. And the unconscious could act as those math themes, or just the symbolic language is allowing that eye to be in a specific location to see the virtual image of the bouquet.
That's really fascinating, and it's worth mentioning that you don't just get the imaginary on its own. The imaginary is always in conjunction with the symbolic. They're coterminous.
Yeah, and I think what he says about it is like you have to be in a specific spot to really see that virtual image where it looks like you're seeing the actual flowers in the vase. Because in a video that you showed me, which I shared on my video on the introduction to the mirror stage and the inverted bouquet, you see how it's like a revolving mirror. So it's like the image is disassociated from the vase, so you can tell it's just an empty vase. And then as it keeps going around, then at one point it becomes a full-on virtual image sticking out of the vase where it looks like it's aligned. I think that's where like the introduction of the virtual image and the real image become the parallax, to where it seems like they're one and the same. What allows that to happen is not, like, as I said before, of just this measurement of the unconscious, but rather, if we're talking about the mirror stage essay, it's this, what keeps that constant is this libido investment, the seduction, the lure, which introduces the formation of the primitive ego, but in the sense that we become more Freudian with it, in which Lacan wants to do, it's the introduction to primary narcissism. you have now libido. No, you don't just have libido investment, you have libidinal economy into ego drives.
Now, at this level here, would you say that he thinks of this as just a more refined illustration of his notion of the mirror stage, or is it also an innovation of that?
I would say it becomes more of an innovation later, but you're right, here it's like a refinement of it.
Right. That's what it seemed, because at this stage, we're dealing with the ideal ego.
Yeah.
And only the ideal ego.
Yes.
The ego ideal hasn't been brought into it. Now, I think it's a little paradoxical, or like, not paradoxical, it's just confusing because, and we were talking about this before, and they brought it up in the PDF that you shared with me. That was really interesting. It's like, what would you literally see if you were positioned here? Would you see the illusion? It wouldn't be the perfect illusion, right? Like, you would still see a kind of disjunction.
And I think that, and I think that's the thing, though. It's like, then you get into the more nuances of these registers, and the way, because fantasy seems to be also deployed in some registers of the imaginary, but there could also be a symbolic structure to fantasy because of the element of desire. This could, even if you get a disrupted image, maybe, let's say, like, hopefully this is appropriate to say, but it's like, even if the inverted bouquet represents one's position in, American discourse, and me believing that, America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, but then you get rights taken away, and today's, and what's going on with today with, Roe versus Wade, for a lot of people, even though they are aggressive towards it, they don't care about the fact that really the structural mechanisms that are happening are causing it. They just want to rebel against the big other and have their piece of the cake, but really they just want to maintain those structural mechanisms, the optical schema, because they have their fantasy. Their fantasy was a little disrupted, but they want that fantasy back. But I could be adding a lot to it, but that's the way it would make sense to me, because you're right, there are a lot of paradoxes, and it could be one, because he's just giving us a slight piece of it, but two, he's still introducing all three registers, and this is still his first seminar.
Right. That's why it's just, all of this is really fascinating. I just want to try to contextualize this specific iteration of the schema.
Yeah.
Which I don't think, I mean, he hadn't at this stage explored all of the different variations that he would ultimately add to this prototype of the schema. But well, you were talking about fantasy before. Do you think even at the level of the ideal ego, is fantasy at play?
Well, there is this, like, what fantasy would be at play would be when the super ego, or the ego ideal, is introduced, because pretty much the fantasy is going is the primal fantasy should be this nostalgia of the going back to the seduction, the lure of the formation of the I, or even to like the mommy relationship. So because the fantasy would happen, and this happens when you get into the other aspect of the introduction to the ego ideal, when there is this further alienation, because there's already this alienation based upon a false mastery of this primal image. But then once the symbolic order of not just language but speech, and we'll just use the Oedipus complex, the Oedipal logic, then that's where you could say fantasy comes into that sense, as nostalgia, as this going back to, as this constant rebellion against the father function.
Yeah, I think a lot of this will start to make more sense when we get to the ideal ego and ego ideal.
Yeah.
chapter. It's like at this stage, what we're dealing with is the uh, the most primary of ego formations, which is the ideal ego. And what he's discussing here is the idea of like, well, the three elements, I guess, would be the box, the vase,
Yeah.
and the flowers.
And it's just like this, like inside the box, it's pure id, drives, desire, the body as it is. But that's the thing, we never get the actual body. In the PDF said there's this like wanting or this illusion that we are in touch with the biological organism as it is, but
Right.
really it's not. It's an illusion, and we can replace illusion with even phantasmatic later on as the more late Lacan we get into, or middle Lacan.
So this is like the crudest sketch that
Yeah.
one has of the unity of the body and instincts, drives, id, in that like we need a container and we need stability.
Yes.
Something like a stability, which is the box to stabilize the container of the vase, which is a real object, the flowers, and we call this a real image, though
Yeah.
there's still, it's still illusory in that these aren't the real flowers. So you could say that we experience our own libido as our own, as contained,
Yeah.
right, within us, and manipulable in some sense.
So pretty much, yeah, right now it's like just understanding the difference between the real image and the virtual image.
Right, and it gets more complicated later, but this is meant to illustrate what Little Dick lacks in a sense.
Yeah.
Is this bare minimum of self-totalization, maybe we could call it, or
Yeah, the formation.
totality of the self. And then it gets a little bit mysterious beyond this point.
Well, I think right here, like now, like, so yeah, here we go. The primitive egos, which we already talked about. So I think like this page prior, like we already discussed, getting into section 2 of it, going down to where you underlined. I think we can get into more detail of that.
You want to take a break first? Like,
yeah, we could do that.
Trying our damnedest to explain the inverted bouquet. We're gonna try to bring it back to our boy Little Dick, the primitive ego, right?
Yeah.
Constituted by a splitting, by a differentiation from the external world. And it makes me think of like how the question that Hippolyte was struggling with, and I realize now hasn't quite been answered, is like, even with the whole projection, introjection thing that was described before, what is this probably mythic moment where the ego does break off and sort of do its own thing? And I think that's what he's trying to illustrate here, because it's not enough to just say, well, like whatever is external is bad, whatever is internal is good, because that still doesn't explain like how we get to the point where I'm me in the world, and I know there are bad things and good things, and this belongs to me, this belongs to. So that's what I guess we're trying to.
Yeah, and that's the whole object relations thing of splitting of the ego, where the differentiation, not just of like its inner world and outer world, but of like in the Kleinian sense, good object, bad object. And the object is never like the actual object in the world, but it's always like a mental representation of what the outer world is supposed to be like.
Right.
The naive realism of an object, or like a philosophical object.
And here he brings up the dyad of container and contained. And I think he says, drawing from ethology, that pretty much everything he's saying at this point, when he talks about primary narcissism, is also true of animals.
Yeah, and this is something too that that Lacan will say in the mirror stage essay as well, that there is a mastery or just the attunement of instincts that animals have, and it's almost like with us, we were like born prematurely because we have no sense of instincts. Like, you know, we wouldn't know when we were a baby wouldn't know it was like immediately in danger. Like if like left outside, you know, it could start crawling and go into the street and not realize that it's in danger of being hit by a car and a car driving by. Like that's how out of whack with our body are. And it's only with the mirror stage that you get this false sense of mastery. And even some animals like chimpanzees, I believe, or he says apes in the essay, you know, get captivated by a certain sense of the mirror stage, but then they discard it because they have no use for it. But it's only us where we kind of identify with this false mastery of owning the body, of saying like, yeah, that's me.
And that's a point that's easy to miss, but is very pivotal here, which is, as he says here, it's like the prematurity.
Yeah.
I think the phrase he uses later, I don't know if it's in this seminar or another one, but the neologism he uses is captation, right? Like capture and captivation in one word. The captivation of the lore, as you said, like the seductiveness of the lore isn't has a prematurity to it, and it's like that sense of false mastery because
and what makes it false is because it's this over identification with this fragmented image, because it's only like an image of like just the frontal body, but we believe it as a total gestalt. He'll use the term gestalt, a perception, where it's like, you know, you couldn't see the totality of your body like front and back. Like even if you had a bunch of mirrors, it's always going to be like mirror related. Like, you know, even in the house of mirrors, it's always fragments. It's like the more mirrors, the more fragmentation. The more images, the more fragmented it gets.
Right, and fragmentation is the word he just used to describe Little Dick's situation.
Yeah.
Of fragmentation. And, you know, it's fascinating because whenever I see the word anticipate, anticipation in relation to Lacan's theories, you can also sort of think about the symbolic order and the signifier and what is anticipatory in signifiers and symbols. And I know that's jumping the gun a little bit, but it does sort of explain, I think, how we relate symbolically to the world is always one of like anticipation, because we felt like we were in a sense graced with this mastery that was never really there, right? It was never truly installed. So our projects in the kind of Heideggerian sense are always like unfolding along the lines of a sort of anticipation of a mastery or wholeness to come.
Yeah.
That is reality pure and simple then, which is not delimited by anything, which cannot be the object of any definition, which is neither good nor bad, but is all at the same time chaotic, absolute, primal. And just to take this back to like, I don't, you know, a very everyday kind of level, it seems like who amongst us haven't had phases where life seemed like this, you know? Like not good nor bad, but like the worst thing is not being immersed in the good or the bad, but like this kind of
chaotic.
And I think the thing that is important to remember is that like life can always at any point sort of come apart at the seams like this, and this is what the great our anxiety is tied to, is this you know, awareness that things can kind of fall apart like this.
Yeah, and I think it's like just to nuance it, because yeah, like anybody could agree, like it's a truism, but it's like, I think in the way that ego psychology would say it, it's just like, it's just, the fact that it's part of evolution, stress and certain environmental variables, come at us and they stress us out, but we work harder and endure under stress. Look how like hunter-gatherers were able to evolve. So like that type of mentality of like when you feel down or chaotic is because like it's this I think I said this before, it's like the simulation of from your amygdala or your medulla oblongata of like the fear of getting attacked by a lion, so you had to go into your primal aggressive mode to conquer it. Using evolutionary psychology and ego psychology. Yeah.
No,
Go figure. But this is more of like some traumatic kernel of the real that comes in through this borremium knot, which it feels chaotic, and that's where I think where you can at least locate where anxiety comes into play at times, or at least wants to let itself be announced at certain occasions.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, like to be announced.
And know that you're not in control. Like you're literally not in control of the world. It is different from like, not just like when you were saying about like life can get chaotic, but like even in terms of like depression or sadness, that's not the same as an anxiety. Because yes, there's like, if we take Margaret Little's account of the broadcaster, he was probably down, depressed, maybe some melancholia, who knows? He was definitely mourning. These are heavy emotions, but they don't indicate something that is actually like real or like actually true in the sense of the register of the real. This is still like a disorientation where he's like his sense of mastery is kind of disoriented. It's like seesawing. It's just like kaleidoscope, but it's not like it's just literally just juggernaut through where there's a hole for the real just to come through and be like, surprise, motherfucker.
Right, yeah. And that there's nothing worse than that.
Yeah.
Surprise, motherfucker. Depression is preferable in many cases to that. And I don't know if you would go as far as to say that depression is almost something like a compromise.
Yeah, it would be.
Protect you
Because
from
people, in some cases, people actually enjoy it. It's the one thing. It's like there's a meme. It's like, why is it that when you're sad, you always want to, or what was it? It's like, it's that one moment when you're really sad, so you listen to sad music to make you even more sad, and it's like a picture of Squidward like with his fucking head in, like laying on the bed. But it's like people would do that. They indulge in it. They watch sad movies. In a breakup, they watch movies of romance happening, and like maybe it's they fall in love, or like it's a breakup because they want to cathart and like really cathex and into something of like, yeah, like that's me, and like I just want to invigorate it and put more, and I just want to inflate this image of tragedy and breakup just so I could feel sad, so it could feel like, or people say I just want to feel something real.
right. And it's like nobody welcomes more anxiety into their lives. Maybe stress. I know people get off on stress. People enjoy stress. It's not the same thing as anxiety, not the kind of anxiety we're talking about.
You get them like really like because I'm in the Navy, I use the term Joe Navy, but like or like you just say those like corporate motherfuckers that are just like always stressed, but like they're always drinking an energy drink and they're getting more stressed, and they're usually like managerial level, and they're just like always micromanaging people. They can never sit down and be easy. If they're sitting down on their break, they're just like, do you need help over there? Oh, are you sure you got it? Like they're just constantly finding ways to stress themselves out so they can be productive. Right. They got to be useful.
Right. And
yeah,
but
and
that shouldn't be conflated with anxiety, which is
definitely not.
Because when that rears its head, it's the only thing that threatens the cohesion of the ego.
Exactly.
And that is something that nobody wants to deal with. And it should be pointed out that it's not the kind of ego dissolution that comes from meditation necessarily.
Yeah, and that's funny that you mentioned that, because even that the PDF commentary of this, which we should definitely put a link for that, and the Melanie Klein thing in this video. it will be in the link. We will
I'll put a
drop that
reminder
link.
here.
We will drop that link. But
I think we'll
like that's the thing. It's like you're talking about like the dissolution of that, but what he was mentioning is like there's never any touch of really being one or in tune with your biological organism as a whole. Because I do yoga at times. I meditate, but it's always certain small instances of embodiment or certain states of just like you can say maybe de-stress or just like where an ease to an excitement, but it's not like, oh, I know my entire body, I'm one with myself. No, because as soon as I say that, then there's an I. That's like, that's Zen Buddhism 101, like, like, or that's like, the polykanon, like as soon as an I exists there's no nirvana or anything. Desire happens, desire happens when the I happens. Like I think, look, that, and this is why I really like the more like I learn about Lacan, the more I think like, oh, I understand Buddhism in a different sense, not in the way that it's taught here in the West, where it's like this like mindfulness simps, nirvana bros, where it's just like, I'm just gonna retreat and meditate and be one with nature, and I'm just gonna see everything as it is without judgment or perception. Just like, no, just gonna put a crystal on your forehead and just like, yeah, I'm just gonna, astral project.
Yeah, well, the key phrase there is project, because you are ultimately still projecting. Nothing to be more projection based than thinking that you've been assimilated in this like vaguely Eastern mystical culture that like you can do with it what you want without ever having to, I don't know, maybe like learn Hindi or something really different.
Learn Sanskrit.
Learn that shit, dog. Like not easy, not always fun.
It's actually very more metaphorical than anything. It's like, I think there's a lot of deconstruction, like, kind of Lacanian, Derridian, where it's like there's no meta language. It's like there's no meta language in that when you talk about like, how they apply it with like their theology and stuff. Like, because even the term nirvana, it's not like anything literal. It literally means the extinguishing of a flame. Like that's what that translates to. That's what nibbana or nirvana, if it's Tibetan or Thai, Pali, it means extinguishing of a flame. Desire is like, or the cycle of desire in samsara is like the axle to the wheel or something like, or the wheel to the axle type thing. Yeah, they don't ever speak they don't speak literally.
That's interesting. Yeah, not a meta language.
I think that's like how, like, if you like take like Western Buddhist bros, like they try to or love and light warriors, they try to like see themselves outside of a meta language and
Love and light warrior.
Yeah.
That's a new one. I like that one.
But like, yeah, it's like they're like, oh, like I disavow the optical schema. Not that they know what that is, but it's like they think that they could be outside of something like that.
Yeah, and somehow they're still able to like judge everyone as harshly as possible, even though I thought it's sort of like philosophy based on no judgment, but apparently doesn't apply when it comes to get it like removing yourself from the experience. But so let's see. I think we've kind of explained how this schema is working. He says something kind of funny here. He's just like, but we aren't an I. What is this I that's wandering around exactly? And he says it's symbolic of the subject. And this is the subject of science in a sense, because he says the whole of science is based on reducing the subject to an I.
Yeah.
Which
and it's funny is because it's like it's always this disembodied I, because it's got to be this I without any bias, without any judgment on measuring the petri dish under the microscope or like a chemistry experiment or whatever, like in the light in the little vial, whatever it is. But with, it seems like, again, like we're using optics, it's like the image relies on the I a lot more and builds upon it. And this is why I kind of was saying in the beginning of like how this is like I see some type of parallel between this and the double slit experiment. This is the first time where it's like measurement was also seen with, light and the photon with the eye as well.
Right. So is it like,
In the way it like characters experience and like, or just like the behavior of the photon particle, we are in our gaze are manipulating the way that, light or just the overall image behaves, but it's really for us because we always objectify it for us. Like, we do have a behavior to it. This is where like you could see the plane of introjection or projection placed in as the form of the light photon, but we're not just talking about physics, we're talking about psychoanalysis. So we're talking about like, in ways, fantasy, desire, all these different things that happen in that plane, even for like a certain structure of a subject, psychotic, the neurotic, the perverse, even people who wouldn't even fall that just want to be normal. There's a certain neuroticization to the structure. They're just not like deep. They haven't fell victim to neuroticism. They might have like instances of depression, seasonal sadness, anxiety disorder in the DSM-5 sense. But you could say that there is some type of neurotic like structure that keeps the fantasy at bay because super ego is still in play. So in a sense, that's like how I see the optical schema and its measurements with the image, kind of like the same thing as the eye or the scientist looking at the photon versus when it's not looking at the photon particle.
yeah, what is more neurotic than the photon itself, which doesn't know what it wants to be? But we can't blame the photon because it's like, it is the paradox of it not in the eye of the beholder ultimately, and how it imperfectly structures reality. And later on, it's really hard not to anticipate the like further iterations of that schema. We're going to see how the virtual subject feeds into this seemingly neutral I that is disembodied.
Yeah, there's no neutral I.
There is no neutral I. So when you see that I there, don't just take it as the I we accept when we watch, I fucking love science type videos, or like, isn't science so fucking cool?
It's built. It ain't built out of the science, guys.
Like, no, this is an I that is problematic in the woke sense. No.
Yeah, no, I mean it's like that meme that I made. It's like what did I say? It was like biology bros and social Darwin simps. And now that science falls into the discourse of the symbolic, and it's a set of practices that could be guided by the ideological state apparatus. It's like there's no such thing as a science outside of the meta language.
Right.
Yeah.
This is funny. Well, first, I want to point out, he says everything depends on the position of the subject. And the position of the subject, of course, is characterized by its place in the symbolic world. It's like, there would not be any subject if it weren't for signifiers. And later, Lacan famously states that signifier is, well, the subject represents a signifier for another signifier. So you could almost think of it as a quirk of the symbolic order. And the tragedy of being human is to like be identified with this sort of dysfunction almost.
Yeah.
And thinking that it's real and trying to endlessly give body to something that's I almost want to say an error. It's something that is going awry here. And well, looking awry, that's what that makes me think of course. It's like, but and the name for this subject is, of course, Pedro. I don't know.
Pedro, yeah, I don't know who that is. But yeah, it's like there's always like reference to, and again with speech, but yeah, the signifier needs to latch on to other signifiers. whether it's like within somebody's own unconscious, but also like a subject and the other, like just another subject. Like I think it makes me think of the Althusserian. It's like you're walking down the street and all of a sudden the cop is like, hey, you there, and even though he wasn't talking to you, but the person like I guess right behind you, but you were caught in his look, so then you were signified in that like subjectivization of the under the law, the cop criminal dichotomy type thing. But it's the fact that there's always some type of signification
or mode of address. And this is again, this brings us just right back to the sort of the contingencies of the symbolic structuration of our own subjectivity and how that relates to all of our explorations, scientifically, philosophically. It's not enough to just say, oh, we have these inherent biases. It's like, no, your subject position is a position. It is a situation. And the thing, going back to the I, and I love how you connected with interpolation there in the Althusserian sense, is that you are addressed by the other. That's the point of the misrecognition also of the ego, is it's not just like, oh, well, the ego is this one thing, but it thinks it's this other thing. It's like, no, the ego is in essence misrecognition, and it's being misrecognized. The I itself is being misrecognized by the illusion, by the real image.
And I don't want to keep it too Althusserian, because I kind of think of like interpolation as like there's just this passive pool,
right?
And as soon as you're born, you're like thrown into it, or as soon as like some interaction happens, you're thrown into it. Sometimes it's like you are interpassive itself, like using Zizek, interpassivity. Sometimes you don't even need to believe in it or even be interpolated in it for it to happen, but it acts for you in that sense. We can think of it like that.
So signifier represents a subject for another signifier. We exist for the signifiers, so to speak. And I know for anyone who's listening to this, hopefully someone will someday.
Yeah.
It sounds all very much like abstract and lofty. I'm kind of losing my voice here. But I like the more, if you're interested in this stuff, it's like the more you stick with it, it's just like it starts to make more sense. But like there's never any correct like smooth facilitative way to like really enter into this, because whenever you talk about one aspect of Lacan's theory, it just welcomes all of these other aspects, and like it's so hard to not anticipate other ideas that he's going to have and like just keep to the text at hand. But
I mean, Lacan is like Henny on its own. You don't want Henny on its own. You need a chase. You need some kind of commentary. You needed that first, but at the same time, it's like, for some reason, I still like Henny, but I got to chase it down.
So you will gain a taste for straight Henny, and eventually, you forego the chaser. But
you realize Lacan's that cognac that you want.
And that's why a lot of people who tried to read Lacan, it's like they went too ham, they drank too much Henny, like never again. And that's their fault. Don't blame the Henny. You overindulged, but
yeah.
So let's see. I want to make sure we don't miss any finer points here, but
I think what's important is when we get into that, when he talks about language itself, or not language itself, but like the function of language in language theory with like Carl Bueller, which I think we're slowly getting into that, because I think that for me was the most important part of this text, because for the most part, I think we're kind of beating a lot of things with the dead horse. We know now when he's talking about the optical schema, we're not just looking at it in the abstract or even in relation to the mirror stage, but in showing like how this negates where somebody like little Dick hasn't went into this, what we'd call classical stage, or just a classical formation of this. And at the same time, it doesn't really negate the fact that he's or negate Lacan's theoretical approach of Melanie Klein, because I think the point about psychoanalysis is it's not a science of universals or trying to posit universals through induction. You know, it's the thing. It's like, can psychoanalysis be a science? You know, some will try to say yes, others will say no, but it is, in a way, it's its own type of praxis. But right, I think to just reiterate, like, we've kind of elaborated a lot, and what makes Little Dick interesting, especially right here with when he's mentioning on the page that you have displayed about like the feces and the poo-poo, is like, now kind of realizing that these are kind of like dangerous objects or objects of disgust, but because he's still kind of caught in this like weird sadism at times, that he could use them destructively. But it's like, he's using destructive, is he using it destructively towards mom or himself, or is it both? Because they're both, he sees himself and his mom as one into other objects. There's no, or can we even say objects, because there's no differentiation at times. It's like, it's this just weird, wild being, this incoherency. And it's always this intersection of what you could call a pseudo imaginary register and the real, because it's not imaginary, like I said, in the sense where like that lays the groundwork for the mirror stage of the inverted bouquet. But he's getting somewhere to where he has some type of form of destruction. But it's like he's hurting himself. It's like he wants to destroy himself. And I think you kind of see the same thing similarly in the case of the wolf child later on.
Can we retrace our steps a little bit and go back to like the whole feces urine thing, which he calls it an equation? Is this the beginning of his like surpassing his psychic state by being
I think so, because yeah, I think so, because like he's not seeing it mastery yet, not in his body and in relation to other objects, but he's definitely getting sense of his body where he sees like, this is coming from me. But it's still in relation to, so far as I think, so far, like he's still, it could be a sadomasochism, because if it hurts mommy, it also hurts me type thing. He hasn't differentiated himself from his mother yet, but there is this sense of good and bad object,
right,
pure destruction.
Right. So if he's living in an undifferentiated world, that means that he hasn't been able to sever himself from the mother, and therefore he doesn't have a clear idea of what objects are. And to have a clear idea of what objects are, you have to have a sense of what are good objects and bad objects.
And your sense of like your body also being an object. And
your body being an object is like, that's the real like crowning achievement of this imaginary
that's the point of the mirror stage, because you identify with that. That's the object of desire prior to, you know, the Oedipalization from secondary narcissism or the development of superego.
So Lacan is giving props to Melanie Klein here, right? Because he's saying like that basically she's working with these minimal signs capable of expressing the inside and outside to build on that, right? To constitute a world of inside and outside for Little Dick. And the way she does that is because he does like, so he does have a kind of interest in trains. So is it like, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong here, but like that he is, at least despite it all, formed an idea of a train, or like has some libidinal attachment to train that's privileged?
Well, I thought the fact is that she had the trains from, I don't know if I remember reading in the actual Melanie Klein's case study, if she had trains there for a reason, or she just has that for all kids. But he was undifferentiated from the trains. He wasn't amused by it. But when he would touch it, he wouldn't play with it at all, or like he wouldn't like try to put it in the tunnel, like, you know, you would associate with like, oh, you see a train, you see a track, let's put it on the track and put it into the tunnel, like, you know, where the pathway. Like, he's not doing anything with that. But at the same time, it's like Lacan was saying that he's not like an idiot because he has like words at his disposal, but like he's using this vocabulary like at the wrong time. It's like he sees the train, but he's not using it in the appropriate sense. And we were talking about like the affect issue, this and that. I think I really want to jump into the key aspect when he talks about the theory of language, if that's not too far. I don't know how we are from that.
There's like 2 more pages to this chapter.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I think that's the next chapter, right?
No, this isn't the same chapter. It's the
Oh, yeah.
like, yeah, it should be like the second page, or like it should be like right before the chapter ends.
Okay, so just before we get to that, just to like sum up one more time, it's like this is where he's surprisingly simple with his language here. But he says it's like a symbolic interjection is always accompanied by symbolic denomination. So
yeah,
the use of signifiers, and of course the interjection of the other. Interjection is always the other entering.
yes.
He mentions the superego quickly, but we don't have to take that detour right now. I'm sure that'll come later. And it's like we have the affective, which again, like the affects are the sign that interjection has been. It's like being able to assume language is very important to Lacan, not just be able to produce vocables, as he says, like kind of haphazardly, but to be able to assume language as your own is the mark of the mirror stage coming to fruition.
So right here, we're getting into the part that I wanted to build up to, which was
okay, yeah.
So we're on the right path. Yeah, I thought we
and
way farther than that.
I guess the only lingering question is, I just not even question, just that I want to make sure that I understand correctly that Melanie Klein was able to, through the use of metaphor, right? The train, like she was able to help create, like lay the first brick of the foundation of a kind of differentiation, at least.
Yeah, and so it looks like that is the case with being able to work with Little Dick and fire off these words and these metaphors, and to kind of, in a sense, Oedipalize them to help develop the primary narcissism towards that. Let's like these kids have there not only is there not a secondary narcissism, there's not even a primary narcissism. They don't have a sense of self, or they don't have any affects or differentiation, to the point where there's if what Leon Brenner says is like they're autistic, like do autistics go into a mirror stage? Maybe, but do they go in a sense where it happens in at least in an idealized mirror stage, or like in the way the optical schema would at least address itself out as in theory? Maybe not, but there's still some type of libido investment. There's a different drive, and I'm just gonna say, like, state that's Leon Brenner says, like, there is a different structure of identity. That's all I could say, is because I'm not familiar with all his work. I'm aware of that, how he talks about the fact that autistics do have a certain structure in their orientation, symbolic.
I need to keep listening to the interview.
Yeah, because this is because he does say that Little Dick was actually autistic, and that Lacan was actually close to realizing that, because in before his time, or like even during his time, like they would a lot of analysts or even psychiatrists would think that people like Little Dick were psychotic, or suffer from a child psychosis, which was different from adult psychoses, but they believe that they were psychoses or suffer from psychoses, which wasn't the case. It just like the symptoms from the structure are very similar, but definitely not the same, just because of the fact that there's this more intimacy with the real.
With autism, there's more intimacy.
Yes.
Real.
At least that's
Can you
what.
explain
I
that?
don't know if I could speak for all autistics, but just the fact that with what they were saying about that in child psychoses, that was the case. What was being diagnosed as child psychoses at the time?
What do you mean by intimacy with the real? I thought psychotics were also very intimate with the real.
Like, because there was this undifferentiatedness with themselves in reality. They didn't have affects in the same way as like somebody, you know, who you look at their development, you look at their history, if they were neurotics, yes, or like they ended up in their later life becoming psychotics. Still, there was some sort of neuroses, but you know, in psychoses, they foreclosed the Oedipal complex. They foreclosed the name of the father.
Because in psychosis, there is you're seeing the unfolding of the process of like trying to differentiate at all times, right? Via the signifier.
In psychosis, it's like, yeah, like there is a foreclosure of the name of the father. So then now there's just like pure imaginary and the real relationship, but never like symbolic anymore. Whereas like if we take even like just to refer back to like Deleuze and Guattari, it's like we start off schizophrenic and then we are in development and growth neuroticized, and that just means it's like or like in schizophrenia psychosis is just the fact that we are just in this raw experience with reality.
But then it's right. So, but with the autism in this case, there isn't even the imaginary, so to speak, or
just imaginary in the case of like of how the development in a neurotic patient who grew up when you find their primal scene. Because again, we're looking at it in not like a subject of metaphysics. We're looking at it as a subject who has a clinical history, who has a case history. We got a history of learning the past, and for neurotics, for the autistics, it seems like it's not the same when if they develop, you know, like if they went through a mirror stage.
Cool. Do you want to wrap it up with the Carl Bueller?
Yeah, and I think this part is very interesting because he says, like, again, like when I was saying, like, he believes that the child is not dumb, he's not like pretty much purely oblivious. He has language at his disposal, but like when the mother like throws certain words out, he responds like, or he uses them negativistically, like, and he's like, he wants to say like there's like, he's not saying that he's using negation or verneinung, like in the sense of like how it was discussed in the previous chapter, or not the previous chapter, but 2 chapters ago. However, he invokes like the theory of Carl Bueller, which I don't know too much about, but I'm just going to reference it in the way Lacan is discussing it, that there are 3 stages of language that we go through according to this Bueller person. There's one is like statements, but it's like natural datum. But from what that, it's just like, and it's just a pure statement, you know. There's nothing to it. It could be just like a fact or anything like that. Like a declarative statement, etc. But 2 is more of imperatives, not just an imperative statement, but something that invokes a sort of positional authority. Like if somebody says sit down, you know, it depends on the authority of which you would listen. Like as a kid, like if a teacher told you sit down, yeah, you will learn to sit down. But after a while, it's like maybe you learn that this teacher really doesn't know shit, so like you can rebel against the teacher. But like, what if like then like you weren't listening and they're like, I'm gonna call the principal, and then like, okay, go ahead. The principal comes in and says, hey, sit down. Then you actually sit down. Or like again, the interpolation, like the Althusserian, like the cop, maybe like you're pretty much, you like to transgress a lot, but then like there's a certain level or hierarchy in which that sort of imperative gets bigger and broader, that you listen. And then there's just
that's the call here.
Yeah, and then there's just the communication proper, which just is the last stage, which just means that not only are there words and data, raw data, or whatever you want to say, or just like language in the symbolic or in the unconscious, or certain imperatives, which it belongs to the law itself as a signifier. Maybe you could say it's the big other, the superego. But then you have the way it functions in communication, and the way that I'm talking to you right now. You know, we're having a discussion about Lacan. I wouldn't, you know, say like, hey, let's schedule today's date to have a discussion on the optical schema, and then just go on about talking about my day, and then never bring up Lacan whatsoever, and just talk about like, you know, the 4th of July, and then like, oh yeah, you know, I did this and that, and then not once. That's like inappropriate. That's like, you know, absurd. And this is what he's trying to get at, is that this kid doesn't have communication proper, in which like he knows when to speak, when not to speak, or what to say in certain altercations, lest he be insane or just like idiotic, or just the fact that he has no connection to communication proper. He has some certain words of language at his symbolic register, at his disposal, I guess you would say, maybe just at his disposal, not the symbolic, but he doesn't know how to communicate to develop the symbolic register, I should say. So he has certain words, he could use them in an odd way. You could say like, it's kind of like, you know, a baby will just say like random words, but they don't know it yet. Like, or if their first word is mom or dad, but they're not really articulating a conversation. Or like, I think I said it before, like the baby's first word, instead of being, you know, mommy or daddy, it's like, you know, shit or crap, but it always infers like whoever said that around them, but they're not really articulating a conversation and using it. There are even some kids who don't even develop a pronoun, a personal pronoun of themselves. Well, they will hit their sibling and say like, hey, you hurt him, instead of saying I hurt you or something like that.
Right. So Lacan puts it really beautifully here, and he says what is crucial here is that this child does not voice any call. The system whereby the subject comes to locate himself in language is interrupted at the level of speech. Language and speech are not the same thing. This child is, up to a certain point, a master of language, but he doesn't speak. There is a subject here who quite literally does not reply. So he doesn't assume himself as a subject within the system of language.
Yes, because look back to function and field. There's a difference. First, there's a difference between language and speech, because we see language structurally and structuralism as far as signifiers and that which is signified in the framework of Ferdinand de Saussure. But we locate or observe speech phenomenologically as an experience that structures subjectivity in a sense as well, or puts it into play. But the phenomenology and the dialectic of it is that there's always this I-you relationship in speech. There is not that in this kid.
Right. And what does Lacan say earlier? The you exists in the unconscious.
Yeah.
For a neurotic subject, I
Yeah.
at a very basic, you know, at the ground level.
Yes.
So I think the only thing that's missing here is, can we bring it back to the train and the station, and she symbolized an effective relationship.
I think in this time she's able to create relations, and him seeing this, being able to connect words together, and then that's what fires off. And it's because like, it's the thing, it's like the difference between somebody like Lacan and Chomsky bros is that Chomsky believes that in order to understand and develop communication, like you have to acquire one word at a time before you could effectively have a linguistic structure. Whereas it's like for Lacan, it's like you only need one word and you're already as savvy with language. That's because you're already interpolating into symbolic, but it's like, how do you communicate that? How do you do that communication proper? And not only just say a word, but use words, because like in some instances, it's like, not only do we speak, but sometimes we speak implicitly, where we don't have to directly say something. Like, you know, let's say like, you know, you come home, like you live with a roommate and you were expecting this Amazon package, and it's like, and it didn't show up the day it was supposed to, and then like your roommate had the day off and he's just chilling all day, and then you come home from work, you're like, hey, did my Amazon package today? And he's like, yeah, but that's all he says is yeah. When the yeah should have been like, you're implying like, yeah, okay, where is it? Where'd you put it at? Did you retrieve it? That's the implication that you're waiting for. It's not just like, yeah. There's always some type of like invocation of like ends.
Right.
Keep going,
Right.
oh, I put it in your room,
Yeah, because the demand implied by
yeah,
question is for, it's something that suffices to illustrate the entire situation, and
or
you're
in the
asking
fact,
specific information,
yeah,
isn't it?
or in the fact of puns too, like just anything like wordplay, like that's the fact of communication or having the symbolic at your disposal. Metaphor metonymy, which we'll get into in seminar 3.
That's interesting with wordplay. It's like, why do people do it? Well, one of the reasons is almost the signal that you are well integrated into the symbolic order. Almost when you play around with words, it's like you're communicating to someone that well, whether to their pleasure or displeasure, depending on whether they like puns or not, it's like that you can manipulate signifiers in just such a way. But isn't there a word for like when you're requesting something is like allocutionary or something? I feel like I read that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
Like
I've heard allocutionary, but like
I think that
the way it's used
might be the wrong word, but like that's the dimension of speech where you're asking for something, like, can you pass the salt? Like, but when you say it like I could use some salt, or like without, when you imply a question, like
yeah, no, definitely. Like you're sitting with your girl watching Netflix and you're looking for your phone and you realize that it's over on her side, like, oh, there's my phone, like type thing. And
right.
You expect her to be like, oh, you want it? But like, that's the play of language, or just like of just communication, not language, but just communication. Or just like not even just like language and words, but also how they refer to signs and stuff. Like, the color green is not just green, that's too abstract. We have green for many things, like green for like the stoplight, or like a street light for go, or like red. Red is not only the stoplight, a stop sign. Red could also be like, oh, when I get angry, I just see red.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny because it's like whenever you're learning something new, you're not just, well, you're always learning a new language when you learn something new. Whether if it's scientific, if it is itself a spoken language, if you're talking about literature, whatever, you're learning a new language. But then what you're really learning in addition to that, you're not just learning data, you're not just learning information, you're not just learning like individual ideas that are in this like nice, neat grid network. You're also learning about all of like the implications and the background of the language itself is something that like only emerges after a lot of time engaging with the study of that thing. But again, like if it's a spoken language, then it's like you're not going to understand all of the cultural implications of using certain words, even if you could live in a country your entire life, and still so much of the like embedded latent cultural notions that inform jokes and things like that will still escape you, because that you can't explain all of those things.
Yeah, definitely.
And this is the the invisibility of it. This is the whole like the way the symbolic order is structured, and the unconscious as this structuration is like, you can't represent that to yourself in its entirety.
Exactly. And I'm no Wittgensteinian Chad, like Ludwig Wittgenstein, but I mean he does say that there's no such thing as a private language. Language is like outside of us, so it's like we're immersed in something that's outside of us. So it's like we're always working with that thing, and I feel like that's kind of very similar to what Lacan. There's probably like a parallel between language with Wittgenstein and Lacan as well in the symbolic order.
Sure, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
With language games and like there's a like a and I think the word is like an automaticity to language that is, we're
Which
always up to it.
You'll say in seminar too that the symbolic order has this automation of its own, like it takes a life of its own, like this like ex machina type thing.
That's what makes the parapraxes so alarming, and why they could be damning in certain cases, is that like it's in those moments, it's not so much the content of the parapraxis as much as like the reality of the parapraxis, where it's like where a Freudian slip is like something where it's like, oh, like you become aware of language getting away from you, and that if you become aware of the fact that like where you're situated is not where you thought you were, because you're always trying to catch up to signification, and like the successful continuation of the ego is one where you always feel like, oh, I said what I wanted to say, where you feel like you're ahead of the signifiers you're using. But Lacan's gonna show that like when it comes to analysis, au contraire, right? It's like, nah, like you're always behind your
Exactly.
And well, there we could take it to like the temporality of the subject and all that, but that seems like a little too heady for now. But this is cool. Like I like this example because, and I think the last thing I wanted to talk about before, this goes on a little bit longer than I thought.
I think it's like a page and a half.
All right, it goes on to 88. So it's like he but this emphasis on like, so we have like libido, this equivalence or equation between like these like privileged objects, feces and urine and stuff, and then like she's like artificially trying to bring about the Oedipus complex. Is that because like, well, he kind of knows what mommy is in a sense already?
Yeah, almost like he's very
there's some layer of differentiation between,
because it's never like the relationship between, if I'm not mistaken, big train as in daddy and little train dick. It's rather there's some kind of like element, or at least like gravitation towards when she's like mentioning mommy station, though, like a little train in mommy station, and how he wants to hide in the dark. It's like there's still this, like, again, the symbiotic relationship with her. Like he hasn't broken away, he hasn't really deciphered his own body from hers. He hasn't had this false mastery of his own body, but like it's like partial objects from his body, especially with the feces and the urine, that still haven't made him realize like my body as a gestalt totality from the mirror stage, whether or not it's a false image or not. I haven't identified with this false image of mastery. I only see partial objects. That's another thing too. Partial objects is a big thing in object relations as well, because you don't see the whole mommy when you're symbiotic with it. You see the breast.
But this is why it's important for her to establish that there's an inside to mommy, and if he's entering her as the little train, that means that he was outside of her at one point.
That too, yeah. But then that's the thing, it's like he's got certain words, he's got certain like weird, like he has, again, like certain languages, like language is at his disposal, but he doesn't know how to enact it in communication. That's, I think, the thing that Lacan was kind of like focusing on. And how when Melanie Klein does her thing that like it starts firing off because language is already at the disposal. Now like there's connections being made.
Right. A sequence of equations which drive him out of the space between the doors where he had gone to seek
Oedipalization.
absolute darkness of the total container. This was the void that we were talking about.
Yes.
And then he brings it back to the ego. Like, why is this the development of the ego? And
Yeah. And that's another thing. It's like the Oedipus complex. Uh, like he realizes like, and I think this is like later on he realizes like he's not as dogmatic to the Oedipus complex, uh, like Freud is, but it has its uses. And I think what shows this is mainly because of the psychoses, but also like I think he just wants to get away from the dogmatism around Oedipus, because of the way it's interpreted.
yeah, because he says earlier, like, oh, this whole like wanting to have sex with your mother thing and like
Yeah,
getting past that and like showing, he said, like, bring out some of the ambiguities here.
I think also because like I don't know if it's this one, but there are some other different tribes where like the Oedipus complex doesn't really take a hold because like the father isn't really the center of the universe for the child. It's mainly the other father figure is or not father, but like the male figure is like the uncle in some of these tribes. It's like the man is only there to, for the mother to bear the child, but really they look up to the uncle or the grandpa, or like mainly the uncle. But then this is what actually ends up creating what he calls the symbolization of the incest taboo, whereas like the father function and as the
Hey,
patriarch in something like Totem and Taboo is where the incest becomes prohibited, becomes a prohibition.
great. And I think that it's like this is where we bring Levi Strauss into the conversation, because it's like his interest in Levi Strauss, now that you're making me think, also probably had to do with this attempt to like undermine what had become this sort of like calcified version of the Oedipus complex, to show that like what's at stake here is not just mommy, daddy,
Yeah.
son, and like the Oedipus myth, so much as like what Levi Strauss says. It's like what ties pretty much, yeah, like all cultures together of any configuration is this incest prohibition, this
Yeah.
incest taboo. And I think that might be one of the elements that like Lacan also wants to emphasize here via Levi Strauss.
Yeah. And like I think what the Oedipus thing is not that you actually want to have sex with your mother, or like it's the fact that like the mother becomes cut off from you based upon this law, or you won't even use mother, but just like object, the lost object is cut off from you by the law that you desire more. There's this surplus jouissance
Right.
of it and his mappings, because it's I mean, there's still, and this is why you should think of it as Oedipus as logic rather than Oedipus myth as meaning like a physical mother and a physical father.
Right. And the law, like I remember reading this in Chiesa that it's neglected aspect of the law as prohibition in this sense is also, it's like the law is also directed at the mother who wishes to reintegrate the child as phallus
Yes.
in some sense. So the law applies equally to the mother. So it's like the incest taboo works both ways.
Mm-hmm. It's the irony, I would say, of the Oedipus logic.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It is, yeah, it is very ironic. there's a lot. Yeah, we could.
Yeah. I mean, I think for the most part, this pretty much sums up the entire thing, because then like what she was able to do was just create some connections to at least create this not only connections in language, but also to allow the result of a connection in language to create differentiation between little dick and little objects.
I wonder what happened with Little Dick.
Yeah, I don't know.
It became a
I
big.
definitely want to get into more Klein's theory. It's not only about that, but just like in general, because it's definitely heavily in a lot of Lacan's work, in the early and middle.
Right, and just to tie it all the way back to resistances and the ego as a defense, it's like, well, we were, one of the misconceptions or the like misinformed approaches that were being taken by the analysts that he's criticizing is that it's like we want to get past the resistance. This is what he's saying about Anna Fritz, like get past the resistances, get past the defenses, have the subject lower their defenses. And he's illustrating here, it's like, well, how the ego is formed as a defense and as a necessary defense in order to be a subject in the world. And here you see what happens when the ego fails to form itself because of, he says, a series of encounters which like doesn't happen in a specific order.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Because of the poor eye, he just wasn't positioned right there, and because like there's no instance of like, I guess you would call it parallax view, where it's like the confusion of the virtual and the real image. I don't even know if that's how
he uses parallax though. He uses
that's why I used it, and I don't know if Zizek actually uses it in the same way though.
I don't. Yeah, probably not in the same way. Especially without an extension, a much larger extension, of course. But
I think he plays upon the same form, but a different context in the way of ideology works with what you would call, quote unquote, the natural social order, if you could call it that. That how ideology mimics that, and it makes it think it's like, oh, what we're living is like the way that humans ought to be. We finally reach progress post-ideological. It's like, nah, that is ideology at its finest.
Right. You could say like, the vase is the vase is like the political slogan, maybe that.
And I need to read the parallax view. I have it, but I'm going off of judgment, like I would assume by
no, I like this. I'm toying with this idea now, thinking like, yeah, the vase would maybe kind of be, if it's a container, it'd be like the thing that you see when you have like enjoy in a political sense, but like the flowers are that the true enjoyment. But what you're seeing is like a nice contained, reasonable point of view that you identify with, because this is just how you've arrived at this through a process of careful deliberation, and that's all it is. There's no enjoyment involved. But you know what it made me think? Another really good Zizek analogy, metaphor, whatever you want to call it, that he uses, that reminds me of what we were just talking about with the ego, is the guy stealing wheelbarrows. Have you ever heard this one? He talks about
no.
So it's like this guy is, every night, I forget what the context of the joke is, but it's like about a guy who's like stealing something, and he was able to get away with it every night because like let's say the guard was lax and didn't care. I don't know, we're in a gulag because and he's like stealing something from the the series of wheelbarrows every night, and then he runs into the guard later after the war when they're both like free men, and the guard's just like, hey, I want to ask you, like, I know you were stealing, and I know I turned a blind eye to it for this long, but like, what were you stealing? I was never able to figure that out. I never got a good glimpse of like what was in the wheelbarrow. And he's like, I was stealing wheelbarrows. He never assumed that the wheelbarrow is the thing that he's stealing. Like, it's the same thing kind of with the ego. It's kind of like this attitude towards like you're looking for the thing that's beyond
Yes.
the defense to get to whatever it is that you think is at the heart of the ego. The ego is the defense, the resistances
Yes.
are what we're looking for.
Exactly.
That the resistances are the wheelbarrows.
Yes. And the language is the mediation for that.
Right. Right. So it's like, look, because language is structure.
Or the speech is mediation. Yeah.
Or maybe not. Yeah. I don't know. I'm starting to falter here, but and I'm having a hard time producing speech because yeah, this is like Lacan not soothing my sore throat to talk about as much as
this time you're going into full speech.
Yeah, going to full speech, and like my body is turning on me though, because it's like, what are you
you're gonna go meta now.
I'm gonna hit. I believe I'm gonna reach the meta linguistic state. I think it can happen. I'm holding out hope.
You finally somebody who found the first meta language.